Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Instant Insights podcast, a global data strategic intelligence. We track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm your host today, Martina Raveni, and today I'm joined by Tom Hopgood, lead analyst in the construction team here at GlobalData. Today, we will discuss Tom's recent webinar called Data Centers Outlook in 2026. You can find in our Intelligence Center. As the majority of our listeners, I'm sure they know, we have been following closely the evolution of data centers as a theme at GlobalData over the last few years. But just to sum up some of the main points and provide some context for this episode, we know that the demand for new data centers is definitely accelerating, driven by the need for AI infrastructure and the continued cloud adoption. And this is, of course, placing increasing pressure on energy grid reinforcement and transmission upgrades. In the same theme, there is also strong capital support, especially from big tech companies, and we are seeing projects be defined by power availability as well. There are lengthy grid connection-led times, there are shortages of critical equipment that can be slow to be delivered. So these are just a couple of challenges, some of the key areas I would love to discuss with Tom today. So let's start. Tom, welcome back to Instant Insight. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Thanks for having me back on.
Fantastic. So I will start very, very general. Data center, again, are a real buzzword in the construction industry at the moment. What's GlobalData view on this market?
Yeah, I know. I mean, data centers have really sort of taken off in the sort of last couple of years in particular. We're now seeing sort of reports from the AGC in the US saying that sort of 1 in 7 contractors now have a data center project on their books, but it still makes up only about 2% of US construction. So a real sort of buzzword despite only being a small part. And there obviously are scope and it might crowd out things like infrastructure and limit that with obviously backlogs for some contractors increasing now up to over 12 months. So they've got more of a year of work currently on their books. So these data center projects are sort of taking up other jobs that would potentially sort of benefit society in other ways. This is definitely a sort of a growth market for sure. And with that in mind, GlobalData is essentially now going to produce output numbers for 31 key markets across the globe. So not many countries at the moment, only the US produce actual figures for data center output. And actually what we can do is we've been able to use our project database as well as different sort of leading indicators and stuff like that to forecast out what we think the data center opportunity is going to be for 31 different countries. And in 2026, we see that at sort of 173 billion across the 31 markets, and then that's going to be forecast to grow up to sort of 318 billion by 2030. So we're going to see a growth rate of about 15.3% in 2026, and then a CAGR of sort of 16.4% between 2026 and 2030. So a real sort of growth market. We're essentially going to see the market expand from only a very small part of construction, so about 0.65% of construction in 2021, up to about sort of 1.28% of construction in 2026, and then up to sort of just over 2% of construction globally by 2030. But that is very different sort of country to country. We're going to see in some markets, places like the US, rise from about 0.5% growth in 2020 all the way up to about 3.8%. And then places like Ireland in particular are going to see substantial parts of their construction market now be represented by data centers, which obviously given sort of dynamics in Ireland and the sort of tax benefits as well, there's no surprise that's going to be a great place. But yes, a real sort of market of growth at the moment, I think, which is quite exciting and definitely it requires a lot of sort of different types of people involved as well. It's not actually that labor intensive, particularly, which is interesting. It's quite a sort of capital intensive industry that we see. But we're seeing sort of reports of sort of work camps where people are going and getting offered things like steaks and get to play golf and stuff like that, and almost setting up with sort of massive RV parks because these data centers are getting built in locations that are sort of in the middle of nowhere. So they're really sort of popping up But with this sort of rise in data center construction as well, we're also seeing a rise in the amount of sort of negativity towards data centers as well. Sort of the noise pollution that they caused, obviously the use of water, as you say, the electricity, and actually without sort of the grid expansion, we're going to hit this sort of roadblock, and that's actually what we're seeing in the market as well. This sort of real sort of bottleneck at the moment in that sort of pre-construction stage, because it requires a sort of central electrical equipment and it requires grid connections or people to essentially bring their own data, bring their own power, which is some policies that we're seeing in locations like Canada, where essentially to build a data center you have to power it yourself. So it's an interesting and evolving market for sure.
Great overview. You mentioned a lot of interesting areas. So just to sum up, there is growth. The growth is different among different countries. The data centers are built in remote locations, and there are many bottlenecks. You mentioned the pre-construction phase, just you touched briefly. Can you tell our listeners what does this phase exactly consist of? Because I know there in the pre-construction there are different phases, at least as we see in our IC. And if you can give us a bit more context in this area, how are we at in terms of pre-construction data center? How many of these will be actually going to the construction phase? So as much as you know, I'm happy to hear.
No, sure. So obviously our new solution that we're just launching this week, we'll look at sort of output numbers in construction for data centers. So actually, what is the sort of NACE Rev 2 sort of construction component of data centers? Whereas we also have a sort of bottom-up solution at GlobalData as well. We've got our construction projects database, which looks at all projects that are over $25 million. We have about 306,000 projects that we track across all sectors and about 5,000 construction projects that we're tracking at the moment. And the aim is to really pick up those projects in that early phase of construction. So picking it up in sort of that sort of announced or planning phase whenever it hits one of our sources, and then we will update the projects every 3 months as they progress through the pipeline. And the aim is to sort of keep adding information, finding out more about the projects, so we can understand actually really what makes up construction, who are the players involved. And what we're seeing is that we have that sort of pre-planning phase. Things then go into that sort of planning phases where sort of planning permission comes in and people actually then design on how it's going to work. We then have these sort of pre-execution phases up to that EPC award where the contractor gets allocated. And then we have an execution phase as well, where the project eventually sort of break ground and we actually see construction happening. But what we're seeing at the moment in data centers is a significant portion of projects that are sort of stuck in that sort of pre-execution phase. So many projects are not actually breaking ground. And even though there's a lot of money chasing a lot of data center projects around the world, there seems to be this sort of bottleneck, particularly in the shortage of critical electrical equipment, particularly things like transformers, switch gears, and batteries, which is sort of limiting this broader grid expansion as well. And although electrical infrastructure only makes up about 10% of total project cost, it's essential for operations and therefore sits on this sort of critical path and sort of causes a bit of an issue with the sort of scheduling risk. And there's sort of insufficient domestic demand, particularly in places like the US, sort of really exacerbating this problem, meaning they're going to have to import from other markets. And some of these markets that they need to import from are places like Taiwan or China. And those are the exact markets where Donald Trump's put tariffs on. So actually, it makes it a bit more of a harder issue than just sort of importing quickly. So it's a real sort of big issue. It mixes in with geopolitical issues as well, and causes this sort of bottleneck in production. But it's not just the US. We're seeing this. We're seeing this as sort of common trend around the world at the moment, and sort of the costs of switchgear and other key components like that are rising, partly due to the sort of impacts of the ongoing war as well.
You highlighted a very important point that I'm also working on. Basically, a lot of data center projects, as you said, are stuck in the pre-construction phase. And this is important because we've been seeing continuously, especially last year, news headlines talking about partnership to build up new data center capacity. Just think about the Stargate project. Us as analysts, but people want to understand will actually be built, or at least will them be built according to the timelines proposed. So that's very, very important what you just said based on data, of course. And this leads to my next question, which is more about the challenges, the bottlenecks that makes these delivery timelines and final capacity added increasingly uncertain. There are time constraints, permitting, environmental reviews, the land acquisition, which, by the way, there is also land scarcity, grid availability. So it takes years, not quarters. You might know better than me. You can see in the project database. But there are also, I'm personally covering the critical materials in general, I'd say availability, like copper, lithium, and steel. It's an issue. It's creating a supply chain issue, and at the same time, also another bottleneck is the viability of cooling systems or AI chips. So there are many limitations about data center build out, even if budgets might be available. If available, you mentioned tariffs, so supply and geopolitical issue that force timelines to be revised. And very interesting at the moment, I'm starting to see this topic arise here and there, is the labor availability as a growing concern. You mentioned before, but I wanted to ask you a bit more. So to increase the construction so rapidly, is the market facing labor challenges? And how is the industry is reacting to this?
Yes, exactly. So I think there's lots of different challenges to unpack there, both in terms of the building materials and sort of the human impact as well. And I think the human impact comes from both inside the market with sort of the labour, as you say, but also with the rising sort of negativity towards data centres themselves. So in terms of the critical sort of minerals and certain building supplies required to build data centres, data centers are very dependent on sort of large volumes of copper, lithium, steel, and other critical materials. And their prices are currently all increasing, partly due to that rising sort of transport costs that we're seeing as a result of the sort of shutting of the Strait of Hormuz. And we can essentially say that things like the World Economic Forum estimate that sort of every additional megawatt of data center capacity sort of requires sort of 60 to 75 tons of minerals and metals. So there's a sort of really large requirement for significant amounts of copper, sort of between 5,000 and 15,000 tons for a hyperscale facility, or sorry, for a conventional data center, or up to about 50%, sorry, 50,000 tons for a hyperscale facility. In terms of the labor, well, I think that's a different challenge. I think sort of the construction industry has suffered with sort of structural issues in the labour market for a while now, partly due to that sort of baby boomer generation leaving the market and retiring, and then you're sort of replacing it with sort of less skilled workers. And particularly with data centers, as we said, it's quite a capital intensive sort of build, but actually the people that are required on site are the sort of the most skilled, highly skilled individuals, and actually that is really what the sort of the construction markets around the world are really sort of lacking at the moment. Sort of we're losing some of the most skilled people, and we're not being able to replace them with people that are as skilled. So you have this sort of skills gap, even if you can replace the jobs. And actually, there's still a scenario where actually we still have a massive gap between the number of people that we need and actually to build and to fit any of these jobs that are required. So it becomes a real sort of issue where we just demand doesn't equal supply in the labour market, which is a real sort of sticking point for many people. And people may turn to things like technology as a sort of solve for this, and may try to sort of substitute labour for sort of capital for labour, and that could be another option as well. But yeah, it's a particularly difficult market at the moment, particularly to hire people. And if you want to build these things so quickly, it requires sort of significant incentives.
Of course. No, that's very interesting. Thanks for clarifying because it's not one of the first challenges that comes to your mind, but actually is one that we need to talk about and address. Now I would move to my final question. Probably it's quite interesting because it's about the future. I wanted to ask you, what's next for the construction of data centers? So, what do you think the future developments will be?
Yes, I think sort of the future of data centers is is really a sort of a bit of an unknown, really. I think I wrote a piece a little bit earlier in the year on sort of Greenland being that sort of next data center sort of frontier, sort of with the colder climate. It could be a great place to put those data centers, the sort of cooling requirements required and the sort of energy capacity required for to sort of cool data centers in somewhere like Greenland will be a lot less than other places. Particularly, we see a sort of large amount of data centers in places like deserts, which obviously require a significant amount more cooling than you would in sort of more sort of icy conditions. And I think that's one reason why somewhere like a Canada would also benefit. Sort of, we're seeing data centers popping up in places like Winnipeg and other sort of more northern provinces in Canada, and actually they can really benefit from those sort of geographical reasons where actually cooling is not so required and there's less water use, and you can particularly use things like hydroelectricity to actually power some of these data centers. But what we are going to see is, I think, sort of growth into things like underwater data centers. Could be the sort of the next frontier. So, an underwater data center are sort of a type of new computing facility which is sort of placed below the surface. I know that sort of kind of makes a lot of sense, but surrounding sort of water sort of cools the servers naturally. So rather than actually requiring the water use, one of the big issues that we see with data centers, it sort of requires any sort of air conditioning, less sort of HVAC. And sort of China in 2026 began the sort of first offshore wind powered underwater data center operation close to Shanghai. And the facility is sort of connected to offshore wind turbines and uses sort of seawater for cooling. It can support sort of AI processing, cloud services, and big data workloads while using less electricity and less land space than traditional data centers. So we're also seeing that sort of negativity come from people, and sort of action groups about sort of taking up space with data centers, the noise pollution, the impacts on the environment. This is one way that this could potentially solve this sort of underwater data center opportunity. And this sort of technology will be important to allow us to sort of consume large amounts of energy and water, but underwater systems will have that lower cooling costs, will reduce sort of freshwater use, and also cut carbon emissions as well. So it shows how sort of renewable energy and digital infrastructure can sort of work together to support sort of the future of AI growth in a more sustainable way. However, there obviously will be some challenges with that. It's going to be a lot more costly, and things like corrosion and underwater repairs will also be an issue as well.
Thank you so much, Tom, for those insights inside. It was a pleasure to have you again on the podcast. You can find out more about data center reports on our Intelligence Center and in the episode description. Thanks all for listening, and from us in Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.